The envelope that changed everything ***. The crowd at 30 Rockefeller Plaza was buzzing louder than usual that night. Under the dazzling stage lights, laughter echoed through the iconic Studio 6B as Jimmy Fallon spun another classic story with his boyish grin and easy charm. He was in top form, but the audience wasn't here just for him tonight. They were here for a man who had become something of a legend, not just on screen, but in the hearts of millions. Keanu Reeves, a name that needed no dramatic introduction. The very mention of it sparked cheers, and when he finally walked onto the stage, modest, humble, wearing a simple black suit with that familiar quiet intensity, the applause turned thunderous. But none of them knew what was coming. Keanu smiled, bowed slightly as he always did, then greeted Jimmy with a warm handshake. "It's good to be here," he said, voice soft but deep, eyes unreadable yet kind. Jimmy jumped in with a few jokes about Keanu's agelessness, joking that maybe he really was Neo from the Matrix, frozen in time. The audience roared, but Keanu's laugh, calm, genuine, was what stuck in the air like a warm afterglow. They discussed old roles, upcoming projects, and some silly fan rumors, until Jimmy leaned back in his chair and grinned. "Okay, man," he said, pulling out a crisp white envelope from his jacket's inner pocket. "So, our producers told me someone left this for you backstage. Said it's important. That's all I know." The crowd went quiet. Even the band stopped playing. Keanu looked at the envelope for a moment before taking it. It wasn't flashy, no wax seal, no gold trim, just his name, in familiar handwriting, small, neat, unmistakably hers. He blinked slowly. His fingers tightened just slightly around the envelope. He didn't open it right away. He looked up, eyes drifting into a space far from the cameras, far from the crowd. Jimmy noticed the change, but kept silent. For a moment, time itself seemed to slow, as if the entire studio was holding its breath. And then Keanu whispered, "It's from her." Jimmy leaned in. "Who?" Keanu's voice was quieter now. "Sandra." A hush fell over the room. Some gasps, scattered murmurs. Everyone knew Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves had shared decades of friendship and spoken rumors, interviews filled with warm praise, but never anything more. At least, not publicly, but this moment felt different. Sacred. He opened the envelope gently, like it might break. The letter inside was handwritten, ink slightly smudged, the paper still faintly carrying a scent that only Keanu would recognize. His eyes scanned the first lines, then the second, then everything stopped. His face didn't change immediately. There was no gasp, no dramatic tearing up. But something shifted, something internal, deep. His breath caught, and suddenly, without saying a word, Keanu stood up. Jimmy called out, "Keanu, everything okay?" But Keanu didn't answer. He folded the letter back into its envelope, walked calmly but purposefully off the stage, leaving the audience, the host, the cameras, all of it dashed behind Dot, and Jimmy Fallon, for once in his life, was speechless. 15 hours earlier, Beverly Hills morning sun poured softly through floor-length windows of a cozy but elegant home, nestled behind a private row of trees. Sandra Bullock stood at the kitchen counter, stirring her tea slowly. Her fingers were trembling slightly. She looked down at the sealed envelope beside her, mug white, simple, but filled with the weight of 1,000 unsaid words. She had written it at midnight, after years of keeping it all locked inside. She had stared at the blinking cursor of an email draft, but that felt too cold, too distant. Keanu deserved better. He deserved something real, so she wrote it by hand. Every emotion, every truth, every regret. She wrote about speed, about Lake House, about every stolen glance between scenes, every laugh on set, every hug that lasted longer than it should have. And she wrote about the time she almost told him how she truly felt but didn't, because she was afraid it would ruin the perfect friendship they shared, afraid it was too late, afraid of the way he always looked at her, like she was more than just a co-star, more than just a friend, but never said anything either. And now she had written it all. Her heart pounded as she sealed the letter. Tonight, she whispered to herself, "He's on Fallon tonight. If I don't do it now, I never will." She called an old friend at the studio, someone she trusted. "Can you do something for me? It's for Keanu. It's important." And with that, the envelope began its quiet journey to change everything. Asterisk backstage to 3 minutes before the walk-off, Keanu had arrived at the studio in his usual quiet fashion. No entourage, no fuss, just himself, a cup of black coffee, and a distant look in his eyes. He was known for his solitude, but today, something felt off. He had woken up with a strange weight in his chest. He couldn't explain it, a kind of ache, as if the universe was trying to whisper something important just out of reach. When a crew member handed him the envelope, he stared at it for a long time. The handwriting sparked a wave of emotion. It was unmistakably hers. He felt like a young man again on the set of Speed, riding a bus that wouldn't stop, heart racing for more reasons than action sequences. He almost didn't open it, but the moment Jimmy handed it to him on stage, the moment those cameras started rolling, something inside him knew it was time. Now, outside the studio, Keanu walked down the empty corridor, the sound of his boots echoing behind him. He didn't say a word, just walked, envelope clutched in his hand like it contained his very soul. The cool night air hit his face as he stepped out into the street. His driver called out from the car. Keanu ignored it. He pulled out the letter again, and this time, standing alone under a street lamp, he let himself feel it. He read it again, slowly, carefully, and when he reached the final line, "If you still feel the same, meet me at the bench where we once watched the sunrise. I'll be waiting." His chest tightened. That bench, Griffith Park, the one place they used to go to when they needed to think, when Hollywood got too loud, when their hearts needed silence. He looked up. The city lights blurred behind the tears forming in his eyes, and Keanu Reeves started walking, not back to the studio, not to the car, but toward the place where maybe, just maybe, a lifetime of silence would finally end. Asterisk, asterisk, the sky was just beginning to fade into hues of indigo and soft blush when Keanu reached the hilltop. Griffith Park was quiet, still caught between night's final breath and the city's first yawn. Birds hadn't yet begun their songs, and the streets below were silent, as if the whole city had given him space to arrive here unnoticed, unburdened. The bench stood where it always had, old, wooden, slightly creaking with age, yet sturdy and empty. He stood before it, breathless, not from the walk, but from what it meant. Memories didn't just surface, they crashed like a wave that had waited decades. He could see them there, his younger self and Sandra, both in jeans and windbreakers, eating burritos from a paper bag, laughing about something ridiculous and trivial. Her hair blowing across her face as she talked about life and love like she was reading poetry off the wind. They had watched the sun rise together more than once here, not as lovers, not officially, but as something maybe even deeper, soul mirrors, kindred spirits who never dared say what was silently burning underneath the laughter. Now, after all these years, the letter in his coat pocket was no longer a letter. It was a map, and this bench was the destination, or maybe the beginning. He sat down slowly, rested his palms on his knees, and looked out across the still sleeping city. Los Angeles looked softer from up here, gentler, as if it had secrets it never told. The horizon was bleeding into gold, and Keanu watched, silent, waiting not with hope, not with certainty, but with the sacred stillness of a man who had carried too many regrets too long. Minutes passed, or hours, he couldn't tell, but then he heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, familiar. He didn't turn, not yet. He just closed his eyes, because the sound alone was enough. He knew. Then came the whisper, barely a whisper spoken like a truth. The world had waited too long to hear. You remembered. He turned, and there she was, Sandra, not in designer clothes, not made up for a red carpet. She wore a simple navy sweater, jeans, sneakers. Her hair was down, swept over one shoulder. Her eyes tired, but shining in the golden dawn. No cameras, no publicists. Just her, just him, just truth. He stood, but before he could speak, she stepped forward and took his hands, and in that quiet second, before any apology, before any explanation, everything unsaid over decades roared louder than any words ever could. "I should have said it years ago," she began, voice trembling but strong, "and I was afraid of ruining what we had, of changing something sacred. But Keanu, it's always been you." He didn't blink. His breath hitched. The world around them melted. His hands tightened around hers, not with desperation, but like a man holding on to something he never believed he was allowed to claim. "You're not late," he said gently, voice breaking. "You're right on time." Her lip quivered. She nodded once, then slowly leaned her forehead against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, and they stood like that under the waking sky. as the sun finally crested the horizon and spilled its warmth over the bench where it all began. 1 week earlier, a letter never sent in the quiet of her study, Sandra had sat alone. The awards on the shelf, the scripts on her desk, they meant little in this moment. She had spent years pouring emotion into characters, delivering lines that stirred hearts. But when it came to her own truth, her own heart, she had always paused. She had watched Keanu's interviews over the years, always struck by the way he spoke about her. Respectful, gentle, always smiling when her name came up, and she'd done the same. They had played soulmates on screen, but off screen, they remained silent passengers on a ship neither dared to steer until now. She opened an old box tucked deep inside her closet, the one with Polaroids from Speed, notes from crew members, and a photo booth stripped for blurry frames of her and Keanu making faces, and then one, the final one, where they looked at each other without smiling. Just looking, like they knew, like they always knew. Tears welled in her eyes. She pulled out a journal and began to write. "Dear Keanu, if I don't say this now, I never will," she wrote through the night. The letter that would later make Jimmy Fallon go speechless. The letter that would make Keanu Reeves walk off stage without a word. The letter that would lead to that bench at sunrise. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't poetic. But it was real. And that was enough. Now, days after the sunrise of news was everywhere. Keanu Reeves walks off Fallon mid-interview. But why? Letter from Sandra. Bullock shocks Hollywood. Are Keanu and Sandra finally admitting their love? 30 years later, a love story begins. But the headlines didn't matter. The cameras didn't matter. Because Keanu and Sandra weren't reading those. They were on a small boat, gliding across a silent lake somewhere outside Oregon. Just the two of them, phones off. No scripts, no masks, just silence and smiles. And stolen glances that didn't have to hide anymore. She looked at him across the water, sunlight dancing in his eyes. "Do you think people can really wait a lifetime to say the right thing?" Keanu didn't answer immediately. He dipped his hand in the water, watching the ripples, then looked at her. "I think some things take a lifetime because they're worth it." She reached over and laced her fingers through his. They didn't need a movie. They didn't need a soundtrack. Life had written their story in between missed chances, delayed letters, and the courage to finally speak. And this was only the beginning. Asterisk, the sunlight through the tall Oregon pines filtered like gold dust across the forest floor. As Keanu stood on the porch of the lakeside cabin, a mug of coffee in hand, the morning chill still clinging to the air. The lake beyond shimmered like glass, reflecting the stillness of a moment too perfect to disturb. Inside the cabin, Sandra's laughter floated through the open window as she tried to coax the ancient radio to play a song without static. The same woman who had once commanded red carpets and box offices now stood barefoot on a wooden floor, wrapped in a wear-upon sweater, to sizes too big, humming off-key to an old jazz tune like it was the most natural thing in the world. And for Keanu, he had seen a lot in his life, the heights of fame, the depths of grief, but nothing had ever stilled his soul like the quiet joy of her presence, like the softness of a morning that belonged to no one but them. They hadn't spoken about the media frenzy, not once. No press statements, no clarifying interviews, not even a glance at the swirling headlines that speculated, exaggerated, or tried to claim ownership of their story, because the truth wasn't for cameras. It wasn't for gossip blogs. It was for the moments no one would ever see, the way Sandra reached for his hand while she read in the hammock, the way Keanu paused every time she walked into a room like it was the first time, the way they didn't need to fill the silence with words anymore because presence itself had become their language. This wasn't a romance born of fireworks or flashbulbs. It was something more ancient, like the tides finally pulling the pieces of a whole back together. After drifting for too long apart, later that evening, they sat by the fire pit, wrapped in one blanket. No scripts, no lines, just Keanu with a notebook and Sandra with her head on his shoulder. He was sketching again, something he hadn't done in years. He drew her not with perfect proportions or technique, but with the gentle touch of someone who knew every curve of her story, every line behind her laughter, every scar she never let the world see. And she let him. No actress mask, no guarded smile, just her, real and raw and unfiltered. "You know what scared me the most," she said softly, watching the flames crackle. He looked at her, silent. "That I'd say all the things I wrote in that letter, and you wouldn't feel the same. That you'd still be kind, still be gentle, but tell me I waited too long. that I missed my chance. He placed the notebook down, turned fully to her, and lifted her chin until their eyes met. You never missed your chance, he whispered. You were the chance. She smiled then, not the rehearsed. Cam already won the world knew, but the broken, beautiful, grateful kind. The kind that comes only when you finally stopped running from yourself. She leaned in, there, foreheads touching, the fire flickering between shadows and golden light around them. It wasn't a kiss that sealed anything. It was the silence that followed, full of breath and warmth and the echo of years finally, converging into this one, undeniable truth. They were exactly where they were always meant to be. 3 days later, the city calls back. Peace of the forest couldn't last forever. The world had noticed their disappearance, and the pressure was building. Their managers, their publicists, their teams all wanted answers. Keanu's phone buzzed endlessly. Untouched on the bedside table, Sandra's agent left voicemails in near panic. You can't just vanish like this, they said. You have contracts, public expectations, appearances. But the thing about disappearing is that sometimes it's not a loss. Sometimes it's a return. To self, to truth, to the only thing that ever mattered. But Sandra knew she had to go back. Not to the press, not to the circus, but to one unfinished conversation, one that had started on a talk show stage. It was interrupted by a letter. That changed everything. She had watched the clip a few times now, only once by herself. Keanu's walk-off had gone viral. Some said it was a meltdown, others called it romantic. But what struck her most wasn't the headlines. It was the silence after he stood. The way he didn't flinch, didn't perform, just left. For her, I want to go back, she told him one morning as they sat by the lake. He looked at her, not surprised, not worried, just present. Together, yes, not to explain, just to thank him, Fallon, for giving us the moment, for not pressing, for letting it be what it was. Keanu nodded. He understood. Of course he did. 2 weeks later, the return to Studio 6B crowd was even bigger this time. Cameras lined the block. Paparazzi waited like vultures. But they didn't care. Keanu and Sandra walked in holding hands, not as actors, not as co-stars, but as the people who had lived through enough to know what was real and what wasn't. When they walked onto the stage, the cheers were deafening. Jimmy Fallon stood with a grin so wide it looked like he hadn't stopped smiling since the night Keanu walked off. Well, Jimmy laughed. You guys sure know how to break the internet. The audience roared. Keanu smirked. Wasn't our goal. Jimmy turned to Sandra. So, did the letter work? She looked at Keanu, then back at Fallon with a soft smile. Let's just say, it found the right heart. The room melted. Applause thundered. But even as the lights shone brighter and the cameras zoomed in, what remained between them was untouched. A private world held quietly between glances, between fingers interlocked, between breaths shared in silence. They didn't tell the full story on air. They didn't need to. But when the segment ended and the credits rolled, Keanu leaned into Jimmy's ear, smiled warmly, and whispered, "Thank you for not asking too many questions that night. That silence gave me everything." And Jimmy Fallon, always the talker, always the entertainer, simply nodded, eyes a little glassy, voice low as he said, "Some things are better unsaid." Later that night, back at the bench, they returned one final time, to Griffith Park, to the bench, to the place where truth had finally met courage. Keanu brought a blanket. Sandra brought tea. They sat like they had before, watching the stars. "I used to think timing was the villain in our story," she said softly. "And now?" he asked. She rested her head on his shoulder, exhaled slowly. "Now, I think we just had to live enough to deserve it." And in the stillness of that night, wrapped in warmth and long overdue peace, the stars bore witness to a love not born from sudden flames, but from the slow, patient burning of two hearts that had finally stopped waiting. The echo of applause from their return to Fallon's stage still lingered in the corners of Sandra's memory as she sat alone that night, beside the window of her New York hotel suite, staring out at the skyline she had seen 100 times, yet never like this. Everything felt different, not because the world was suddenly watching again, or because tabloids had plastered their photos on glossy covers, like a long-lost fairy tale finally awakened, but because now, after all these years, something inside her had gone still. Not quiet in a hollow, aching way, but quiet like peace, like closure, like beginning. She ran her fingertips along the edge of the letter she had written. The original copy, still folded in her journal, still smelling faintly of ink and lavender from that night she had poured her entire soul onto a page. She thought about burning it once this chapter had started, but something told her to keep it, not as a keepsake, but as a marker, the moment her silence became truth. Across town, Keanu sat on the rooftop of his friend's loft, legs dangling over the ledge, guitar resting on his knee. He strummed softly, absent-mindedly, not aiming for music, but for memory. Every note reminded him of her, not just Sandra the actress or Sandra the icon, but the Sandra only he knew, the woman who once cried silently backstage after a scene, because the emotion had clung too tightly to her. The woman who called him at 2 a.m. just to read a poem she loved. The woman who never asked him to be more than himself, but made him feel like he could be anyway. He had loved her longer than he had admitted, not just to others, but to himself. And now that love was no longer bound in restraint. It was free. And freedom, he realized, wasn't loud or grand. It was soft, like breathing again after holding it for too long. The next morning, they didn't plan anything grand. No red carpet appearances. No interviews. Instead, they went to a bookstore in Brooklyn, just the two of them, caps pulled low, hands intertwined. They wandered through shelves and flipped through pages, stealing glances more than headlines ever could. At the poetry section, Sandra picked up a slim volume of Rilke and opened to a passage that had once moved her deeply, but that now felt written for this very moment. She read aloud, quietly, only for him to hear. The point of marriage is not to create a quick commonality by tearing down all boundaries. On the contrary, a good marriage is one in which each partner appoints the other to be the guardian of their solitude. She stopped, looked up at him. He nodded, a small smile touching the corners of his lips, and kissed the top of her hand. That night, back in the hotel room, Sandra pulled out an old voicemail she had saved. It was from years ago. Keanu had called her after she won an award for a role that no one had expected her to take, a raw, gritty drama that stripped away all glamour. He hadn't said much in the message, but his voice cracked when he told her he was proud. She had listened to that message 100 times, maybe more, but now, she let him listen to it. He sat beside her on the bed, her phone in his hand, eyes closed, breathing in the sound of his younger self saying the words. He never had the courage to speak to her face. When it ended, he looked at her, eyes glossy, and simply said, "I meant every word then, and even more now." Flashback. Years ago on set, he was late at night during a shoot for a film that never made it to theaters. They were both there, not the stars of the project, just part of the ensemble. A rain scene had delayed filming, and most of the crew had retreated to trailers to wait it out. Sandra and Keanu had found themselves sitting alone under a plastic tarp with thermoses of soup. From the craft table, the conversations had shifted from scripts and careers to childhoods and fears. She had spoken of her father's silence. He spoke of grief that never truly left. And in the middle of that raw vulnerability, Sandra had turned to him and said, "You're the only person who doesn't ask for the public me." He had smiled, soft and honest, and replied, "Because the real you is the one I admire." She had looked at him then, eyes wide, the words hovering on the edge of her lips. But the moment passed, the crew returned, the lights came back on, and the truth returned to silence. Until now, present day, an invitation they didn't expect. It was a Thursday morning when the invitation came. A letter, hand-delivered, embossed with gold. The Academy, not for a nomination, not for a speech, but for something else entirely. "We are honoring the unspoken stories of Hollywood, the friendships, the quiet legends, the truths that never made headlines but shaped hearts. And we want both of you to be part of it, not as actors, as yourselves." Keanu read the letter twice. Sandra read it once and then looked at him. "Do we?" He shrugged. "Do you want to?" She thought for a moment. "Only if we tell it on our terms." So they agreed. One stage, 2 chairs, no script. The night of the Academy tribute test stage was bare except for 2 wooden chairs and a soft spotlight. No clips from movies, no montages. Just Keanu and Sandra, seated side by side. The audience, actors, directors, industry titans, sat in a hush. When the moderator asked, "What made this friendship last through decades?" Sandra took a deep breath and replied, "We didn't chase moments. We honored them," Keanu added, "and when the world asked for headlines, we protected what was real instead." The crowd leaned in, but it wasn't performance. It was presence, raw and real and human. Before they left the stage, Sandra turned to him, placed her hand on his, and said, "You once told me we don't need to play lovers on screen to be something eternal. I finally believe you." And Keanu, ever the quiet soul, simply whispered, "You always were." That night, on the balcony after the tribute, they didn't go to the after party. Instead, they returned to their hotel, kicked off their shoes, and stepped onto the balcony that overlooked the city lights. Sandra leaned into him, her voice barely audible above the hum of distant traffic. "What now?" He kissed her forehead gently, wrapped his arms around her from behind, and said, "Now, we live." And in that quiet moment, with no audience, no applause, no scripts, just heartbeats and healing and the weightlessness of truth finally spoken, Keanu and Sandra stood together as the people who had defied the ticking clock of timing, the noise of fame, and the silence of unspoken love, and emerged not as a story the world demanded, but as the one they finally chose to write. Asterisk, the days that followed were not marked by press tours or headlines, but by the gentle rhythm of something far more precious: normalcy. For the first time in decades, Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock weren't walking red carpets, fielding rehearsed answers, or hiding behind polite smiles for flashing bulbs. They were making breakfast together in the quiet of Sandra's home, laughing at burnt toast and arguing softly over the right way to fold laundry. They were reading the newspaper side by side on the porch, sipping coffee as the morning sun crept through the trees. Keanu took to fixing the old creaky hinges on her screen door, and Sandra surprised him by digging out an ancient PlayStation from her attic and challenging him to a racing game they used to love during late nights on set. There was no audience, no applause, no pressure to be anything but to people who had always felt something deep and unexplainable, and who were finally letting themselves live inside it. And yet, in that gentle stillness, there were shadows that still lingered. You don't bury feelings for 25 years and unearth them without trembling. Sandra, one night as the rain poured down on the roof above them, sat curled up on the couch, watching Keanu read from her favorite book of poetry. He was halfway through a roomy verse when she quietly asked, "Why didn't we do this sooner?" He looked up slowly, as if the question had not surprised him, but rather haunted him too. He closed the book and placed it beside him. His voice, when it came, was low and steady. "Because I wasn't ready. Because you weren't either. Because maybe the universe knew we'd only honor it if we came back to it with everything we'd lost and learned." She looked at him, eyes glistening. "I was scared that we'd ruin what we had." He nodded. "I was too. But I think we spent so long preserving the friendship that we forgot we were also protecting ourselves from heartbreak. Even if the heartbreak came from silence." Sandra reached for his hand and held it tightly in hers. "Then let's never go quiet again." 1 month later, the Paris night that changed everything. They didn't announce it. They didn't tell friends. They just packed the bags and flew to Paris. It wasn't a movie premiere or film festival this time. It was just them, on the streets that had once seen them as tourists in their 20s, walking hand in hand now with white streaks in their hair and history carved into their skin. They rented a small flat above a bakery in Le Marais, where the smell of fresh croissants wafted through their windows every morning, and the elderly couple who ran the place downstairs assumed they were just another quiet American couple seeking a little romance in the city of light. And they were right, but not because Paris gave them magic, because they had brought it with them. One night, under a silver sky by the banks of the Seine, they sat on a bench near Notre Dame, wrapped in one coat, his arm around her shoulders, her head nestled against his chest. There was a musician playing violin across the bridge, and the world, for a few glorious minutes, felt like a perfectly composed film with no need for dialogue. Keanu turned to her, lips brushing against her temple, and whispered, "Do you ever think about forever?" She smiled without opening her eyes. "I used to be terrified of it," she murmured. "But with you, I think it finally feels soft." They didn't speak of marriage. They didn't need rings or ceremonies. Their bond wasn't sealed by tradition, but by time, by all the years they loved quietly, by every scene they played where they had to look away before their eyes betrayed them, by every airport goodbye, every missed call, every moment they swallowed feelings just to protect something they didn't even know how to name. Now, there was no need to protect it. They could live it. Flash back, the scene that almost broke them years ago. During the filming of The Lake House, there had been a scene toward the end of the movie where their characters finally reunite. It was meant to be a soft kiss, followed by a long embrace. But when the cameras rolled, something in Sandra broke. Tears had poured before the kiss ever came. her body trembling in his arms. Everyone thought it was just brilliant acting. But Keanu had known. After the director called cut, she had walked off set, locked herself in her trailer, and didn't come out for hours. What no one knew was that she had written him a letter that day. A letter she never gave him. A letter where she admitted that the kiss had felt too real, that it scared her, that it made her realize just how deeply she had buried her feelings. But she never gave it to him. Instead, she burned it in the trailer sink, watching the edges curl and blacken, trying to destroy something she couldn't yet face. And Keanu? He had felt it too. But like her, he had retreated, because they were playing characters who got to live a love they weren't brave enough to claim in real life. And that knowledge haunted them both. Now, in Paris, Sandra confessed it. "I wrote you a letter that day," she said softly, fingers trailing along the river's edge. "I told you everything, but I burned it." Keanu was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, edges worn. "I wrote one too," he said. "I kept it." He handed it to her. She opened it with trembling hands. It wasn't long, just a few sentences, but it was enough. "I think I've loved you in silence longer than I've loved anything out loud. If you ever feel the same, say nothing. Just look at me a second too long." "Oh no." She looked up at him. Their eyes met, and they stayed there, looking, not blinking, not smiling, just seeing. A second too long. He knew. That night, one candle, one table, one promise that they dined alone in a tiny restaurant tucked into a quiet Parisian alley. The waiter lit a single candle and left them alone. There were no phones, no cameras, no interruptions. Just them, sharing wine and bread and memories. At one point, Sandra placed her fork down and said, "If we had done this 20 years ago, do you think it would have lasted?" Keanu considered it, then shook his head softly. "No, we were too proud, too guarded, too busy playing versions of ourselves the world expected. We would have tried to be perfect instead of just present." She nodded slowly. "Then I'm glad we waited." He leaned forward, touched her hand, and said something so simple, so steady. It anchored the rest of the evening like the final line of a novel long overdue. "I will love you in silence no more." She blinked back tears, whispering, "Promise?" He looked at her, eyes burning not with passion, but with reverence. "Promise." The seasons changed quietly. The headlines faded. The cameras, once thirsting for the next public appearance, found newer stories, newer faces, fresher chaos to consume. But Sandra and Keanu remained untouched by the rush of the outside world. They had stepped out of the spotlight not with defiance, but with grace, slipping into a life so simple, so human, it made all the noise feel distant, like a dream they'd both finally woken from. Their days now moved like soft waves, not grand or extravagant, but slow, intentional. Breakfasts in sunlit kitchens, afternoons spent reading to each other on porches, silent walks where one would reach out and the other would already know. It wasn't the life of celebrities. It wasn't even the life of former ones. It was just life, real, earned. Love. Sandra had always feared endings. Maybe it was the actress in her, trained to live through every emotional arc, every heartbreak, every farewell, knowing that the credits would eventually roll. But with Keanu, she had learned that love isn't something that begins and ends. It lingers, it evolves, it heals, it deepens with silence, it breathes in the quiet. She often watched him from across the room while he tuned his old guitar, or scribbled poems into a worn notebook, and she'd think, this is the man the world admired for being mysterious. But the truth was, he wasn't mysterious. He was just kind, just gentle, just present in a world that had forgotten how to be. She hadn't fallen in love with a mystery. She had fallen in love with a man who had waited to love her back, even when it would have been easier to walk away. One rainy evening, Keanu surprised her. He came home soaked, his hair clinging to his neck, his coat dripping across the wooden floor. She scolded him for not calling, but he only smiled that soft, unshakable smile and handed her a damp brown envelope. It wasn't sealed, just folded. Inside was a piece of thick, aged paper. She recognized the handwriting immediately, but it wasn't his. It was hers. The letter, the original one, the one she thought she burned. She froze. Her hands trembled. "I never told you," he said. "But when I came to your trailer that day after filming the lake house, I saw the ash in the sink. I knew what it was. I pieced together what I could, and I kept it. I wasn't ready to read it then. but I couldn't let it be lost. She opened the folded paper, the handwriting faded but still legible. As she read the words her younger self had written, raw, terrified, and so full of longing, her heart broke and healed at the same time. Because now, decades later, she wasn't that woman anymore. She wasn't afraid. She was a silent dot, and then, gently, she folded the paper back up and said, "I don't need it anymore." Keanu stepped forward, pulled her into his arms, and whispered against her forehead, "Me neither." A year later, the letter on the nightstand. Sandra woke up before sunrise. The room was still. The window cracked open just enough to let the spring breeze whisper through the curtains. She turned toward the other side of the bed, empty, but not in the lonely way. She knew where he was, the garden. He always went there early, before the birds even stirred. He said it was when the earth was still dreaming, and he could hear the clearest thoughts. She sat up, pulled on one of his flannel shirts that now belonged more to her, and noticed a single sheet of paper resting on her nightstand. A new letter. Her name was written on it. Only her name. She smiled, unfolded it, and began to read. "My dearest Sandy, this isn't a letter of confession. We've already done that. This isn't a letter of longing. We've already lived that. This is a letter of gratitude for the mornings you've given me, for the years you didn't even know were mine, for the silence you filled with your laughter, for the bravery it took to finally say what we both swallowed for too long. You were never just the girl on set, never just the co-star, never just the maybe someday in my story. You were the story. If tomorrow never comes, I want you to remember this. I didn't fall in love with you. I stayed in love with you. Every single day. Quietly, faithfully, without a script." Tears spilled before she could finish. She folded the letter against her chest and looked out the window. He was in the garden, hands in the dirt, planting new tulips just like she loved. She didn't go to him. She didn't need to, because in that moment, she realized that the greatest love story wasn't the one the world had waited for. It was the one they had lived in silence, away from the noise, beneath the spotlight, under the rain, in the pages of letters they never sent. Until they did. Final scene, back on Jimmy Fallon's stage. One last time 12 years later, the world hadn't forgotten. Keanu and Sandra returned. Once again, to Studio 6B. This time, there was no mystery. There was no envelope. There was only love, visible, quiet, full. Jimmy welcomed them like old friends. At this time, he was the one with the letter. He pulled it from his pocket, read the first line aloud, and smiled. "You once walked on my stage, Keanu," he said, "but that letter walked you into the rest of your life." Keanu looked at Sandra. She looked at him. The audience held its breath. Then Jimmy handed them the final envelope, one sealed in gold, a commemorative letter from the Academy, and inside it, written in delicate ink, "To the greatest unscripted love story Hollywood never wrote, but life did." And as the lights dimmed and the applause rose once more, Keanu reached for Sandra's hand, and they stood, not as guests, not as icons, not even as legends, but as the people who had once loved in silence and were now writing the rest of their story out loud. The end.